I'm presenting on behalf of the director of CIE, Robert Partisius, who couldn't be here, and myself. Robert and I have teamed up for the last 6 or 7 years to work on these programs. I want to talk about capacity building and implementing maritime and underwater cultural heritage programs and the benefits this can provide. And I'm going to do this in context with the broad concept of maritime and underwater cultural heritage, being inclusive of shipwrecks, but also other types of tangible and intangible heritage. Also in context with the International Convention, the Unesco Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage, as the best practices in implementing maritime archaeology. Also in context with the multivocal values I see that are inherent in sites, and the contemporary community uses of some sites, and how maritime archaeologists can assist communities and other stakeholders in their work. And I use this term stakeholders to include communities, but also politicians, bureaucrats and academics as all being stakeholders in this. I see, well, it's fairly well known that maritime archaeology is a relatively new field of systematic study. Much of the initial work and some of the continuing work is on shipwrecks, or much of it's still on shipwrecks, what I consider using a single scientific approach from a single dominant cultural perspective. This has led to the development of the Unesco Convention, which came in force in 2009, and now 32 countries have ratified it. The Convention is seen as the peak universal agreement on the principles and practices that apply in international waters and a country's internal waters. The aims are to protect and preserve sites, to prohibit commercial exploitation, and to facilitate international collaboration on many aspects. The Convention applies to heritage sites, not just shipwrecks, underwater heritage sites, not just shipwrecks and artefacts, which means it should be the catalyst for many broader-based programs and have relevance to and benefit many people. The following case studies are examples of some of the work that Robert and I, through the CIE, have been doing in consideration of ratifying the Convention and the approaches used by CIE in developing capacity to effectively run a maritime archaeology program. Some of the projects in other countries are also highlighted as they provide examples of the multivocal perspectives and contemporary uses and the different approaches that can be considered when researching and managing much sites. So I'm going to go from Sri Lanka to Hong Kong to Micronesia to Tanzania and South Africa in the very short time I have. So I'm just going to skim through some of the work that we've done there. I did present a paper which elaborates more on the work that we've done in these countries. In Sri Lanka, Robert and I, through CIE, were associated with a project that started with a side-scan sonar survey of the Galle Harbour. And here in the top left you'll see the harbour where about 20 sites were identified, some of them dating back to about the 13th century. On the right is a photo of the Galle Fort, the World Heritage Fort that the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English set up from about the 17th century. The project was motivated by possible destruction of these sites due to changes of use of the bay in Galle Harbour and the need to record and manage these sites. One of the sites turned out to be a Dutch shipwreck called the Arvenster, 1659. It was an English ship, actually called the Blessing, that was captured and reused by the Dutch, changed its name to be called the Arvenster. And the funding was obtained through the Netherlands Mutual Heritage Programme to implement a survey and excavation project of the site. The project also focused on building up the capacity of the Sri Lankan team, what quickly became an official maritime archaeology unit was established, and plans were initiated in developing a new maritime museum as part of the aims of the project. About 20 archaeologists and conservators came from all over Sri Lanka to participate in the project, along with many foreign consultants in archaeology, conservation, website design. A whole range of multidisciplinary consultants came and helped the Sri Lankan team. The capacity building in some cases started with language courses, teaching people to swim, teaching people to dive, and then considerable hands-on work in maritime archaeology, field work, and in situ and artefact conservation. Over a period of about 3 years, this program went for. The site, the Arvenster, was surveyed, pre-disturbance or non-disturbance survey, through to an excavation. 3 excavation areas in the bow, the midship and the stern area were carried out, and 3,000 artefacts were recovered, and research was implemented on the site and the ship. Conservation of the artefacts were carried out by the trained conservators and the newly trained conservators from Sri Lanka, and a 500-page report was put together. A lot of that was written up by the newly formed Maritime Archaeology unit that came out of the team. Unfortunately, in 2004, the tsunami that went through started not far from here, hit Sri Lanka on a Sunday morning. So fortunately, the team were not in their base. The right-hand side shows their base, which is right on the water's edge. This wave went right over the top of their base and washed away 2,000 of the 3,000 artefacts and blew their whole base to pieces. Fortunately, there was a lot of international support, and they rallied around the team and actually then put together a building, renewed a building that was inside the fort. So it was much higher, behind a solid wall, and they could start again. And a Unesco field school was run there from 2006, 7 and 8. Only 2 years after the tsunami had really wiped out their base and their facilities. So a strong sense of ownership and spirit had developed from the capacity building and all the work that everyone did. A new maritime museum was developed, displaying some of the Arvenster material that was left, but also quite a bit of the other material that had been collected from the area in Sri Lanka. Today, further work is being implemented by the MAU. They're still very active in Sri Lanka. They participated in the UNESCO Field School in Thailand and other international projects. We're also now seeing Sri Lankans asking questions and researching foreign shipwrecks in relation to Sri Lankan social issues using Sri Lankan perspectives and values. For instance, an initial way of approaching the investigation of the Arvenster site could be in association with broader Dutch sites and histories, and investigating how the Dutch influenced changes in Sri Lankan culture and ways of life. I mean, the caste system, for instance, where they influenced Sri Lankans to take on new roles and changes to villages to come closer to Dutch ports. For instance, the map of Sri Lanka here shows 2 large yellow circles down the bottom. That's very close to where Gaul Harbour is. That's a production of cinnamon. Initially, the cinnamon was grown further north, but because the Dutch port was down there, they came closer to the port and they produced their cinnamon there. So the Sri Lankan ways of life and their occupation, the caste system, were being influenced by the Dutch. So Sri Lankans are now, after our initial work on that shipwreck, from a Dutch perspective, we're starting to look at this site and other sites from their own perspectives. This is just a suggestion of a way of research that they could look at the Arvenster. The multivocal recognition and different approaches used in researching site was a feature of some of the work that I did in Micronesia. And just to refresh your mind about Micronesia, I'm going to look at two areas in the Federated States of Micronesia, which is a smaller part of Micronesia, essentially 5,000 kilometres east here of Singapore. More than 60 ships, part of the Japanese World War II fleet, were sunk in a lagoon called Chuuk Lagoon by US forces in 1944. They initially they were thinking of dropping the atomic bomb on this fleet of ships. Chuuk, or it was called Truck in those days, was the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. And the US promoted Truck's bombing as a payback to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Today, the sites are valued as historic sites associated with the US defeating Japan and as great dive sites for predominantly American tourists, which in a lot of cases has brought tourism. One of the sites here is the Fujikawa Marine, which is a 7,000-ton merchant ship. A lot of the sites here are merchant ships that are intact, sitting on the bottom from 50, 60 metres down to just a few metres in what is essentially a big, clear, blue, warm water swimming pool. Beautiful diving. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the sites provide a tangible link to the war and the terrible human tragedy, as highlighted by human remains, bomb damage, and the vast quantity of war machinery, as well as artefacts associated with the crew. In regard to the open war graves, many Japanese are disturbed by divers touching and even looking at human remains, which is a continual source of national sorrow, although the Japanese government are aware that they do provide some economic benefit to local Chuukese. And this economic benefit includes tourism, but more widespread benefit comes from dynamite fishing and from selling artefacts to tourists. It was found that Chuukese do not greatly value the sites as historic or archaeological sites. Because the ongoing US-Micronesian relations, the approach used in managing the shipwrecks is essentially a US approach, where the Japanese value is acknowledged, but essentially ignored, and the Chuukese values and issues are too difficult to manage. The inadequate management by the US and the Micronesians won't be fixed until the management includes these different values. And where values conflict and impact site preservation, other resources, such as aquaculture, could be established to take the pressure off these sites and provide another source of food money for local people. And you can see here one of the sites at the bottom right is a 55-metre ship called the San Francisco Maru. You can see the round sea mines in the bottom, and divers go down there, take these sea mines off. I've heard of divers going down and running out of air at 55 metres after 24 minutes, coming up, dying, getting resuscitated and so on, but a lot of those bombs do come up. Then they break open the bombs. Sometimes they'll kill themselves in breaking open the bombs. They break open the bombs for the dynamite, and they then put them in the small bottles, and then they take the small bottles of dynamite back to the shipwrecks and throw them on the shipwrecks. And you can see here the bridge, the vertical bridge of a ship that's the bombs have been thrown on continually. It's stripped all the coral off, and you can see it's a greeny yellow colour from the corrosion that's starting up from the coral being stripped off all the time. But it's the economic incentive from one of these bombs is about $2,000 from one bomb. $2,000 is a huge amount of money for a group of people where their gross domestic product is $1,000 a year. They can make $2,000 from one of these bombs. But they're great dive sites. But there's a lot of different values that the management is not taken up, unfortunately. I want to move on to, I guess, a more pleasant, Chuuk is a pleasant place, but Yap is another place in Micronesia where I did some work on fish weirs called Atch in Yap, where this work was initiated or instigated by local residents. The Yappies maintain many of their values, customs and cultural practices, and the fish weirs are one of their most tangible reminders of a sustainable tourism or fishing practice that they wanted to revive. In 2008, 2009, I carried out a survey of about 450 of these 800 fish weirs, and you can see this is an illustration of one of them. We did an intensive survey, about 45 of them, and found 15 different styles of them. You can see one down the bottom here, aerial photograph showing 3 of these arrow-shaped hatched together. The work was not just to compile a database of sites, but it was to look at how they were built, where and why, and also to begin a program of identifying and understanding the sites for restoring and reinvigorating a sustainable fishing practice and the associated cultural practices for the benefit of contemporary Yappies. In Hong Kong, there's just a small group of people that I've trained through the Nordic Archaeology Society course. We applied for money from the Hong Kong government and were awarded a small grant to start a database of sites. We're carrying on with this project the last year or two, and we've since done a survey of a small area off one of the Hong Kong islands and found quite a large ceramic scatter, fairly recent sort of ceramics, but still potentially for 236 islands in Hong Kong waters, there could be more of these and older scatters. Other sites like a Tin Hau Temple Lion, natural features like this rock is a natural feature that it's called Khao Si Cha. Khao is the Cantonese name for this rock and gives the name to the islands there. And this is the muscle of a pearl shell represented by the 2 islands that are opened up. So these are some of the features that we've been recording in Hong Kong. I'd better move on quickly to Tanzania and South Africa. Tanzania, we've been setting up a similar capacity building program over the last 2-3 years. We've trained 14 people using a phased approach, meaning that we're spending time there to getting to know them and their sites and their values. In some cases, like in Sri Lanka, we've had to teach them to dive. But the program now, we have these trained people implementing a database, implementing research, and again, there's natural features like this small rocky limestone outcrop in Kilwa-Kisawani, one of the World Heritage Swahili settlements, that's a very marked part of the cultural landscape of this area and very important to local people. There's other sort of sites, shipwrecks and so on, that we're recording there too. And we're recording sites where they're important for divers. The corals are important in divers coming and looking, so we're not interfering with corals and disturbing them as part of the work. In South Africa, we're doing the same sort of thing. This is the Netherlands funding again, but we're looking at a range of tangible and intangible sites, from the Khoi Bushman people from probably 2,000 years ago and their fish weirs or visvires, to the Dutch shipwrecks, through to looking at working with other communities from the region, from Mozambique, from Kenya, Tanzania, coming together on Robben Island. We've now formed a much maritime and underwater cultural heritage regional group that are now working on collaborating and in wanting to push the program forward as a much group, regional collaboration group. I just wanted to finish off by just summarising what we've done. I believe that capacity building programs are about empowering people and groups with knowledge, skills and choices. They're positive signs that the programs that we've done are effective and benefiting the stakeholders in the various countries. Sri Lanka now has a strongly committed maritime archaeology unit of archaeologists and conservators implementing relevant research and management. South Africa has a small team of 4 that are working with a range of stakeholders to make sure their program will be relevant and provide sustainable benefits. Tanzania is an enthusiastic team of 14 trained staff from 6 stakeholders covering the length of the coastline, of which only one works full-time on the MUTCH program, but they're all very keen to implement more work and get more involved. In Hong Kong, it has been shown that a small voluntary group with a small amount of funding and linkage to stakeholders can help to reveal different values of underwater cultural heritage and the associated intangible heritage. The case studies highlight the importance of a broad concept of MUTCH, using a collaborative, multivocal approach that can benefit many stakeholders and help to reveal aspects of a group or a nation or a region's cultural identity. A paper that we prepared for this conference also highlighted how international collaboration can be effective in pursuing a group's objectives. The Sub-Saharan African Regional Group found it beneficial in coming together to pursue common issues and link their common heritage in regard to maritime and underwater cultural heritage. Perhaps it's a way forward for countries in Southeast Asia. The concept of a coalition of rainforest nations, which I've talked about in the paper Robert and I put together, suggests that it is possible in Southeast Asia to work collaboratively on common issues, needs and heritage and gain international assistance, as is required in a MUTCH program, or through SPAFA, which is already there. And also the Unesco Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage does encourage support and caters for international collaboration. Thank you.